bear with an introduction which is slightly longer than the typical Friday evening lecture introduction for a reason that I'll indicate towards the end of the introduction. Our lecturer this evening, Lorraine Pangle, is a professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, where she is also co-director of the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Study of Core Texts and Ideas. She is the author of 4 books and dozens of articles in the field of political philosophy, and though her interests within this field are wide-ranging, they cluster around 2 main themes: the principles of the American founding on the one hand, and Platonic Aristotelian political philosophy on the other. Her first book, The Learning of Liberty, The Educational Ideas of the American Founders, pursued a theme which she had already addressed as an undergraduate at Yale, where her senior essay, Education and Liberty, a Study in the Thought of Thomas Jefferson, had won the prize for the best senior essay in the humanities. She turned to the thought of the American founders, not just as a scholar, but as a citizen, and later as a parent, in order to understand how education could help meet the challenge of forming men and women who, while free to exercise their American right to pursue individual happiness, would still possess the public spirit necessary for maintaining a republican form of government. And this distinctly American question is closely connected to the broader questions that have guided her study of Platonic Aristotelian political philosophy. She has been asking, it seems to me, what kind of virtue or nobility can live up to the demand, a demand that, according to Socrates, is at least implicitly felt by all of us, that true virtue must be good for the virtuous individual himself or herself. And since precisely the aspiration to noble self-transcendence seems in this way to bring us back to ourselves and to our own need for the good, it makes sense that she has also been asking what kind of society can subsist among individuals who are clearly aware of this. She pursued these questions in her second book, Aristotle and the Philosophy of Friendship, which was published a little over 10 years ago, as well as in her most recent one, published this year, Virtue is Knowledge, the Moral Foundations of Socratic Political Philosophy. As it seems to me, she has come to hold the view that the highest virtue, as well as the highest form of friendship, is possible only among philosophers who live together in shared intellectual activity. But let me add at once that Ms. Pangle has not lost her capacity to appreciate admirable people even if they fail to live up to the highest Socratic standards. For perhaps her most delightful book is devoted to the political philosophy of that most delightful American, Benjamin Franklin, a man who seems to have thought that intellectual virtue was more closely allied with the active or political life than the Socratic philosophers did. Miss Pangle does allow herself a few criticisms of Franklin's thought in the light of the more austere classical understanding of virtue. But her obvious love for Franklin the man, for his roguishness as well as for his warm-heartedness, shines through every page of her book. And to read it is to be reminded how fortunate we are to be Americans and to have men like Franklin among our founders. To be reminded of this is a good thing in itself, as it seems to me, and it may be an indispensable beginning for us if we are to approach the more philosophic thinking to which Ms. Pangle's study of the ancients has led her. Now, I had originally prepared this introduction for a lecture by Ms. Pangle at last spring's 50th anniversary celebration, but an injury prevented her from coming to Santa Fe to give it. But since then, I have learned one relevant fact. It turns out that among Ms. Pangle's wide-ranging interests are Homer's gods, since On Homer's Gods is the title of tonight's lecture. Her treatment, I learned this just a week ago. Her treatment of this subject may be closely related to the broad themes of her earlier work, Though having not heard the lecture, I cannot assert this as a fact. What I can say for certain, though, is that she will help open our minds to important and stimulating questions. It is my pleasure to present to you Lorraine Pangle.
Thank you, David. I think that's the kindest and maybe the most thoughtful introduction I've ever gotten. And among other things, you added a couple dozen articles to my CV which weren't there before. I have a great deal of difficulty writing anything short, it seems. So maybe there's something in the works. Maybe there's another book in the works on Homer, I don't know. But anyway, I've had a lot of fun thinking about him, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here tonight at the home of the study of the great books in the United States, St. John's College, and to be invited to talk about one of the first and deepest and most influential of the great books in the Western canon, Homer's Iliad. The Iliad is one of a tiny class of books that if you read them well and you learn them by heart and you ponder them over and over and live with them and learn to see the world through their author's eyes, each one of them constitutes a whole education in itself. The Iliad is a deliberate education, I think, both for individuals and for a whole society. Part of a deliberate and brilliantly successful project of trying to shape a civilization. Before Homer, there were peoples who spoke Greek. They were polytheists, worshiping many different gods, who represented different things, as most people of the time did. After Homer, the Greek-speaking peoples shared a common pantheon of gods and a whole outlook on life, and they all called themselves Hellenes. And they claimed outrageously, but not perhaps unreasonably, that everybody else in the world was a barbarian. Socrates, in Plato's Republic, gives Homer credit for making the Greeks what they were. He calls Homer the educator of the Greeks. Herodotus identifies Homer's central achievement, shared with Hesiod, as giving shape to the pantheon of Greek gods. We might be tempted to say that Homer's gods are a little strange, and sometimes more than a little childish, and that his great achievement was his depiction of human beings, and especially heroes, his understanding of humanity as something brilliant and worth celebrating, even if the best human beings are flawed. Even if human life as a whole is more tragic than happy. But I think that Homer's portrayals of humanity and of the divine are inextricably related, and that a great deal of what he teaches us about ourselves, he teaches by means of his portrayal of his curious gods and the relations of humans to these gods. And I'd like to say further, as a hypothesis that I hope to make some progress tonight and at least making plausible, Homer's way of presenting the gods and men was a very important cause of the Greeks' greatest achievements. Their discovery of beauty, the beauty of nature, and especially the human form, their celebration of humanity, their invention of tragedy, their development of republican self-government, and their development of philosophy. So my question for tonight, how does Homer encourage human beings to think about the gods and themselves in relation to the gods? And what effect does it have on the human spirit to see the world in the way that he encourages us to do it? These are very preliminary thoughts. I hope we'll have some time for some discussion, and you'll push me on various things later, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well, because so many of you have been teaching and reading Homer. What's most strange and dubious about Homer's gods comes out starkly, I think, in contrast to the other depiction of the divine that most of us are most familiar with, the Bible. The God of the Bible is the creator of everything that is, eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, the sole ruler and lawgiver and judge of human beings, righteous and holy, profoundly mysterious, utterly awe-inspiring. No human being can look in the face of God and live. The gods of Homer, by contrast, are limited in their power and their knowledge. There are many of them. They're often quarreling, not to say squabbling over petty things. They're surprisingly human in all their passions and pleasures and weaknesses. They enter into battles and love affairs with humans. They get angry on behalf of their favorites. They swear. They break their oaths. They lie. They deceive one another. They fall prey to uncertainty, forgetfulness, vanity, sleep, delusion, and sexual desires so strong that they literally lose their heads. In the Bible, the best human beings are the most aware of their unworthiness, the most humble. Think about Abraham and David. In Homer, the best human beings are the proudest, above all, Achilles. Now, Homer's gods, to be sure, are much stronger than humans are. They're beautiful, they're imperishable. Their lives are only very lightly touched by sorrow, but they can be whimsical and unjust. Are they really worthy of reverence? Why does Homer paint them this way? I'd like to suggest that he's involved in a very complex project in his depiction of the gods. And the complexity is reflected in the way the gods function in a story on different levels. I think there are at least 5 of them. So to begin to see the complexity of this project, it's helpful to consider these levels separately, and I'd like to call these levels the literal, the metaphorical, the experiential, the hypothetical, and the ontological. The literal. The gods are real characters who play real parts in the story just as much as witches and dragons do in fairy tales. On a metaphorical level, the gods often are representations of our passions, our experiences, things like love and hatred and death. On an experiential level, Homer over and over again shows humans' experience of being touched by or spoken to a god. And he does this in an extremely subtle and accurate way, I think, that reflects the actual human experiences of being in contact with something divine beyond us. Then on a hypothetical level, I think Homer is engaged in a running thought experiment. What would we be like if we didn't have to die? If everything else about us was the same, except we just took away this one little fact of our mortality. And I think many of the things about the gods come into focus when you think about them as an exploration of that question. And then finally, the ontological level, there are all kinds of hints and puzzles pointing us to wonder whether the gods really are powerful the way they're supposed to be, whether they really are immortal the way they're claimed to be, whether they even really exist. So let me go into some detail on each of these. On the literal level, within the premises of the story, the gods unquestionably are there and they act in the story, and they have superhuman powers. Apollo sends the plague right at the beginning and kills people with it. Lots of gods rescue their favorites out of battle, or turn away arrows, or make arrows go straight to kill people. Zeus mostly stays above the fray, but then he's Zeus. He shouldn't have to dirty his hands with simple errands. He's the most powerful. All of the rest are afraid of him. So on this literal level, he seems to be truly strong. The gods also literally act in the story by persuading people to do things, sometimes with a benevolent purpose, sometimes with a malicious one. One very interesting question to ask about these gods taking their story and their actions literally is, just how just are they? Homer's gods come to sight, I think, in a certain way, very much concerned with justice, in other ways, and at other times, shockingly unconcerned with justice. So justice comes into the story right from the beginning. The story begins with anger, with a cascade of different characters filled with anger. And anger is always sparked, I think, by perceived injustice. The gods get involved as characters respond to injustice with anger, and the gods feel anger as well. So you have Menelaus, and then Chryses, and then Apollo, and then Agamemnon, and then Achilles in turn getting angry, and this drives the story. And Apollo does punish the Achaeans for something that Agamemnon has done wrong. And Thetis persuades Zeus to help the Trojans against the Achaeans in order to avenge the honor of her son. And Zeus promises this, and it matters to him to keep his promise. That seems to be a real sign of an attachment to justice. And he gets angry with people that lie to him, like his messenger Iris, who he keeps having to scold, be a truthful messenger Iris, but she seems to not listen. On the other hand, on the unjust side, these gods seem to be so often more interested in defending their own favorites than being impartial. Homer's Zeus is not a lawgiver. Many of the Greeks thought that their laws came from Zeus, but Homer doesn't portray him that way. Zeus's whole plan in the Iliad is motivated at least as much by a desire not to displease Thetis as by a desire to right a wrong. Punishments, when they come, are indiscriminate. All the arrows of the plague striking down all the Achaeans when it was really Agamemnon's fault. And among the gods, it seems to be the same way. Athena warns Ares at one point that if he keeps defying Zeus, Zeus is going to batter us all, she says, the guilty ones and the guiltless. And maybe the worst and most troubling thing is that the city of Troy has been devoted to Zeus. It's been absolutely faithful in sacrificing to him and honoring him. Zeus loves Troy. The Achaeans could win, and Achilles could be vindicated without Troy being completely obliterated, but Zeus allows it to be obliterated because Hera wants it to be. And it seems to be completely an arbitrary hatred on her part. Finally, in Book 24, we see the reason for it, which was her vanity, that she lost in the judgment of Paris. So this is very troubling. Zeus has his famous scales that he holds up to determine the fates of characters, but these are not scales that measure justice. They seem to just measure fate. And fate is mysterious. And its connection to Zeus's will is mysterious. Is his will somehow working through the scales to determine what's going to happen, or is he simply listening to fate? That seems to be quite a question. And then also on this question of justice, Achilles says there are two urns on Zeus's doorstep, joy and sorrow, and for some he mixes both, and for others he gives only sorrow. Either way we suffer, and either way it seems as if our sufferings are not mainly our own fault. So in short, Zeus and the other gods are somewhat concerned with justice, but not nearly so concerned with upholding justice as the human characters think and hope, not as much as we would hope ourselves, I think that a god ought to do. Turning to the metaphorical level, these gods represent human qualities and passions and experiences as well as aspects of the natural world, sometimes in very beautiful and apt ways. Some of the Olympian gods have clear symbolic meanings. Ares, the god of war, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom, are a nice pair, and it's charming that Homer makes Athena stronger than Ares, although far from all-powerful. Dawn and the sun are gods, as they are among many peoples, but Homer even makes the hours gods, and he calls salt divine. Making all of these commonplace things divine, I think, endows the ordinary aspects of our life with a kind of grace and beauty that's characteristic of Homer. But more of the divinities that have this metaphorical quality to them seem to be forces of destruction. So Homer includes among the gods the two brothers Sleep and Death, and hatred, and the companions Panic and Terror. He has Phoenix tell a charming story about Ruin, who runs on swift feet, and the spirits of Prayer, the daughters of Zeus, who are lame and slow and come limping after to heal the wounds. Homer makes Dream and Rumor divine beings, and even Zeus's messengers. And he makes Delusion a god who deceived even Zeus. And Zeus got angry with him and threw him out, and that's why Delusion runs around on earth among us. Oddly enough, it seems to be still afflicting Zeus too. So by making all these aspects of life into divine beings, I think there's, again, a suggestion. The good and the bad in life has something divine about it, and the bad is mostly not our own fault. There are forces stronger than us at work that can take us over, and many of these forces even afflict the gods. One, I think, very important, revealing example of a goddess who carries a strong metaphorical meaning is Aphrodite. She acts literally in the story. She breaks Paris' chin strap when Menelaus is pulling him by his helmet and allows him to escape. She also represents human love and shows the power that it has. And I think the choice to make her one of the Olympian goddesses, one of the high goddesses, is part of Homer's work in making every aspect of our life seem divine. There's a very strong contrast here with the Bible. In the Bible, sexuality is a sign of our lower nature that we share with the animals and not with God. It's an object of shame. It's inextricably bound up with our fallen, sinful condition. For the Greeks, sexuality is one of the divine things in human life, and it's a beautiful, irresistible goddess who presides over it. So the celebration of Eros is part of the Greek celebration of humanity and celebration of life, and I think Homer is important in having taken them in that direction. Another very interesting set of divinities are the Muses. They function literally in the story as the source of Homer's knowledge, it seems, but perhaps even more importantly as metaphorical embodiments of human knowledge and the gift for poetry. Homer's references to the Muses, like his reference to dream and rumor, contain, I think, an important commentary on the problem of revelation. So in the proem, at the very beginning, he asks for the Muses' inspiration, but he tells them what the story is that they are to help him with. In Book 2, in the catalog of ships, he again humbly asks for the Muses' help. And he says, "Tell me now, you Muses, who have your homes on Olympus, for you who are goddesses are there, and you know all things, and we have heard only the rumors of it, and we know nothing. Who then of those who were the chief men and the lords of the Danaans, who then of those were the chief men? I could not tell over the multitude of them, nor name them, not if I had 10 tongues and 10 mouths, not if I had a voice never to be broken and a heart of bronze within me, not unless the Muses of Olympus, daughters of Zeus and the Aegis, remembered all those who came beneath Ilion. I will tell the lords of the ships and the ship numbers." And then he goes on to tell who were the lords of each ship. Notice what he just did. He gave the Muses credit for being able to tell something that he didn't need the Muses for because he wasn't going to do that. And his own knowledge of the lords seems to possibly have another source. Then he recounts the story of a man who boasted that he could surpass the Muses themselves. And for this they struck him dumb, and they took away his memory. Nobody even knows his name anymore. So what's the significance of this? Do the Muses really exist, and did they really strike him dumb for dishonoring them? Or is it that they exist, and they aren't very wise, but they are touchy, and you've got to placate them, and he's flattering them? Or is it possible that they don't exist, but a poet has to seem to honor them and has to seem pious if the poet wants to be heard and remembered? Or maybe the Muses exist, but as his own spirit of poetry, his own somehow divine intellect that he knows is really his, pursued in such a way that he takes with utmost seriousness people's experiences of the divine, and in this way helps to ensure that he will not be forgotten. At any rate, 5 curious things happen right after this mention of the fool who was struck dumb for dishonoring the Muses. Homer casually mentions a natural phenomenon that makes the earth resound just as if Zeus were throwing his thunderbolts. Human feet, a big human army. Second, he indicates that he has other sources by relating what they say. Third, he reports that Iris came to the Trojans to tell them the Achaeans are coming. But in fact, there's a huge cloud of dust coming up over the plain because there's so many of them coming. Iris takes the form of who precisely the guard who was there posted to watch for the Achaeans and tell the Trojans when they're coming. Are some divine messages nothing more than human alertness? Then fourth, Homer manages to give a catalog of the Trojan ship, the Trojans and their tribes and leaders, without invoking the muses or seeming to need them at all. And then fifth, he mentions a prophet, a man named Merops who had the art of prophecy, who he said tried to prevent his 2 sons from going into battle where men die. Now that's something that many people already know. So it's a little bit of an underwhelming example of prophecy, reinforcing the thought that so-called inspiration might be human observation and alertness and judgment, at least sometimes. So in all these ways, beginning with the fact that he starts his whole poem with an appeal to the muses, Homer is making the question of divine revelation a big question, front and center in his poem, in a way that the Bible doesn't do at all. The Bible just starts, and we have no idea where it came from and how we know it's true. One other way that the gods seem to function metaphorically is a very curious one, and that is the repeated statements of Homer's that when people do foolish things, some god has taken their wits away. Now maybe this is meant literally. They were struck with a kind of insanity by the gods. Maybe it's a figure of speech, but I think there's something more than that going on here. Homer says this about Agamemnon, Pandarus, Glaucus, Patroclus, and Hector. And almost invariably, just before he says some god took their wits away, and they make a foolish decision, they express some hope in divine support, or a sense of having a nobility that deserves divine support. So for example, Agamemnon says more than once, Zeus took his wits away when he quarreled with Achilles. And right before he does that, he says, Zeus is on my side, because he's on the side always of the elders. And that seems to have perhaps contributed to his indignation and his overconfidence and made him go too far. Glaucus is tricked by Diomedes into trading his armor of gold for Diomedes' much less valuable armor of bronze. And Homer says that Zeus stole Glaucus' wits away. This is the moment when Glaucus is fired with such enthusiasm for the nobility of himself and Diomedes and the way they can be true friends even across the battle lines. And he's been speaking about death in a very moving, interesting way that we'll come back to. So something filled him with enthusiasm, and then he made a bad mistake. At the end of the book, just one last example here, Athena deceives Hector into thinking that he's not alone, that she's his brother, and so sets him up to be killed by Achilles. And he has just expressed a strong hope that the war god is impartial, which is false. And this thought, the war god is impartial, I have as good a chance as anybody, is what keeps him from being prudent. So maybe, at least in some of these cases, talking about what the gods do is a metaphor for talking about what faith in the gods does, the human experience of the gods, that can make us overly indignant or perhaps overly hopeful, or maybe both. And this brings us to the third level on which the gods function in Homer. He lays out the human experience of the divine as it seems to respond to us and speak to us and forewarn us and thwart us. As it seems to do these things, whether anything is out there or not. And Homer does this in amazingly rich and realistic ways, in the prayers and the premonitions and the humans' experiences of encountering gods. So on the simplest level, Homer accurately portrays human experiences of the divine in the way he has the gods take part in battles. They don't just throw rocks out of the sky. Nobody experiences that. They protect the warriors by steering their arrows the right way or not, or inspiring them with confidence, breathing strength into them. Just the things that people think God or the gods have done for them in battle. And they do this more the more furious the humans are. When the battle reaches its climax of anger over the body of Patroclus, it feels as if the whole cosmos is getting involved. And Homer, I think, at least in one case, shows us very clearly the power of believing in the help of the gods when the help of the gods is not there. In Book 3, when the Trojans make their special appeal to Athena, Hector goes back into the city and makes a special offering, and all the women pray, and they're very hopeful that this is going to work, and the Trojans are all extremely pleased when he comes back, and they start to win. And Homer has just told us Athena didn't listen. She turned her head away. So it doesn't matter sometimes what the gods are doing. The experience of believing in them can be incredibly empowering. On a deeper level, Homer shows a connection over and over again between human experiences of the divine and moral experiences. And one thing that's really interesting here is the way the gods seem to speak selectively to humans, to particular individuals who are already predisposed to listen to what they have to say. So consider the examples in Book 1. Hera pities the Achaeans because they're dying of the plague. She doesn't just take Chryseis back to her father herself. Could she? I don't know. She doesn't just make Agamemnon send her back. Could she? We don't know whether he would listen. Instead, she inspires Achilles to call an assembly. It's Agamemnon's job as king, as the leader, to call assemblies, and only a very brave warrior would take his place and take the initiative in doing that. Not necessarily clear that anybody else would have heard Hera's call to do it except Achilles. And then how exactly does Achilles experience this call to step forward and take a risk on behalf of the army? Does he experience it as Hera right there in the flesh, clearly Hera telling him to do this, or does he experience it maybe somehow as the better angel of his own nature? It's ambiguous because when he retells the story to his mother, he doesn't say anything about Hera's prompting him. And in this first assembly, of course, Achilles calls for a prophet to tell them what's wrong. He promises Calchas his protection. He flies into a rage against Agamemnon when he demands somebody else's woman in place of Chryseis. And this is all Achilles' own character moving him. He's charging like a bull without any hesitation. But then at a critical moment, he hesitates and feels torn. Agamemnon has just said, okay, go home. We don't need you. Who cares about you? He threatens to take Achilles' girl, Briseis. And then Homer says, and the anger came on Peleus' son, and this wonderful metaphor, and within his shaggy breast, the heart was divided two ways, pondering whether to draw from beside his thigh the sharp sword, driving away all those who stood between and kill the son of Atreus, or else to check the spleen within and keep down his anger. Now as he weighed in his mind and spirit these two courses, and was drawing from its scabbard the great sword, Athena descended from the sky. When we're torn between doing what we want to do and what we think is moral, that's when we're especially open to hearing a divine voice, the voice of our better angel, telling us what to do. And in this exchange, Athena she doesn't just separate them. She doesn't tell Agamemnon to back off. Agamemnon might not listen. She does speak to Achilles, and precisely in the terms that he's already predisposed to see as noble and fair. What does she say? Come then, do not take your sword in your hand, keep clear of fighting, though indeed with words you may abuse him, and it will be that way. And this also will I tell you, and it will be a thing accomplished. Someday, 3 times over, such shining gifts shall be given you, by reason of this outrage. Hold your hand then, and obey us. Then in answer again spoke Achilles of the swift feet. Goddess, it is necessary that I obey the word of you two, angry though I am in my heart, so it will be better. If any man obeys the gods, they listen to him also. So in this exchange with Athena, Achilles is experiencing what many people experience when they seem to feel a divine presence or a divine call. First, it's experienced as a call to resist or rise above our inclinations. But it doesn't just come out of the blue. It seems to come in support of our own sense of what's right and our own sense of what's dignified. Because Athena doesn't just say, knuckle under and take it, you're not in charge. Achilles would hate that. But she does say, obey the king and you can revile him. And she reminds him that he has his power directly from Zeus. And Achilles feels the strength of this claim. And then third, with this sense of a divine call comes a sense of assurance that in obeying, we're going to do what's best for us as well. So the call is somehow both to transcend our self-interest, at least rise above our inclinations, and to think prudently about our own happiness. And this is a combination that Socrates in particular thought long and hard about. Second example, in Book 2, Zeus has decided to honor Achilles and make the Achaeans suffer for Agamemnon's mistreatment, and so he sends this lying dream to tell Agamemnon falsely to attack because he's going to be with him. And Agamemnon, again, thinking he's heard from Zeus, and therefore thinking he doesn't have to be so prudent himself, everything's going to go swimmingly, he foolishly decides, this is the moment to test everybody and find out who's really with me and who's not. Let's all go home, he says, and to his horror, they all say, hooray, let's go home, and they all go running for the ships. Except one person, Odysseus. Odysseus is the only one who's standing still. And Athena comes down to stop the army's disastrous flight. Hera has told her, go speak to all the warriors. Athena speaks to Odysseus. He seems to be the only one who's ready to listen and to hear this call as a divine call. An apparent counterexample would be Helen's experience with Aphrodite in Book 3. After Aphrodite has rescued Paris, or maybe love has made him flee back to the city, we're not sure. Aphrodite prepares a bath for Helen and for Paris, and she calls Helen, come to your husband now. He's having his bath. And now for the first time, the voice of a god or a goddess comes as unwelcome and even shameful. Helen is having bad regrets, and she realizes her man is a coward. And Aphrodite has to threaten her. She says, I'm going to hurt you and you're going to be sorry if you don't do what I say. And so Helen complies. Very strange. The goddess of love threatening to hurt somebody if she doesn't go into the marriage bed of her husband. But isn't this in a way true of our experience of Eros sometimes? Don't we sometimes think that it just forces us to do things that we didn't really want to do? And so isn't Homer still being true to our psychological experience of these things that we sometimes think are divine and sometimes think are just maddening and crazy? And this example of Aphrodite, I think, brings us back to this curious moral ambiguity in Homer's gods, that in some ways they do share our sense of what's right and call us to what's best, but in other ways they don't. And maybe this is, in a way, just a further reflection of our experience. So, on the one hand, it's true to human experience of the divine that we hope for divine help, not just when we need help, but especially when we think that we've been done an injustice. And the other side of that is, when we are experiencing something terrible like the plague, we're inclined to view it, if we're believers, we're inclined to view it as a divine punishment. And so people don't just call for a scientist, but they also ask, what have we done wrong? And so Homer, in telling a story in which it's human anger that draws the gods into getting involved, is showing us how we especially feel the gods are involved when we're especially either in the right and we need their help, or we're especially in the wrong and we deserve punishment. But on the other hand, there's so much arbitrariness here. There's so much indifference. And in a way, this fits also with our experience. The beings that human beings pray to so often seem mysteriously harsh and deaf, precisely to the pleas of those who are best, who have worshipped them the most. They seem more involved in acts of destruction than preservation. Consider our language, acts of God. Acts of God are not nice things. They're extraordinary natural events that destroy cities. What preserves us mostly is just for things to go along in a normal way. So there seems to be something especially capricious in what we experience as especially divine. And one of the things that I'm wrestling with, that I don't feel like I really understand in Homer, but it's intriguing, is the way he plays up this capricious side, this fickleness or inexplicable hostility on the part of the gods or on the part of fate. So again, if we compare the Bible with Homer, in the Bible, when human beings suffer, it's because God sent suffering on them. because they're guilty and they deserve to suffer, no question about it. And we see one character in Homer who expresses the biblical view. That's Antenor, who speaks up on a bad night in the Trojan assembly, and he says, this is all our fault. We're harboring Helen. We shouldn't be. We should give her back. We broke the truce when Pandarus shot his arrow, and we're in the wrong. And Priam and the other Trojans won't listen to him. Hector expresses the alternative view in the same book, very close to that spot, where he says, I think Zeus is just ill-disposed to both sides. So who's right within the story? Troy is destroyed, but it's not destroyed because it's guilty of having harbored Helen. It's destroyed because of the hatred of Athena and Hera, fundamentally. So what we have here is a fundamental divide in human ways of understanding suffering. The view expressed by the Bible and Antenor in Homer, that the highest divine being is unswervingly just, and that when we suffer it's because we're guilty and deserve to, versus the view of Homer, many of Homer's characters, that humans are almost the equals of the gods. We have no reason not to hold our heads high. When we suffer, it's no proof of guilt at all. Fate is fickle. The universe can be strangely hostile to really excellent human beings like Hector. And I think all this contributed enormously to the Greek celebration of pride over and against the Hebrew celebration of humility. And a final important element of the human experience of the divine that I think Homer captures magnificently is the overwhelming sense of premonition that we often have and that seems so uncanny. We're absolutely sure we know what's going to happen. Many characters in Homer express that certainty. Many of those premonitions come true, but two things are amazing. Many of them don't, and very often the same character, even a heartbeat later, says something different. So our knowledge of the future seems to shift and change. And one nice example of that is Hector speaking to Andromache in that moving scene at the end of Book 6, when he says, I know a day is going to come when Troy is going to fall, and you and our son will be taken captive and made slaves. And this is what troubles me the most, the thought of you as a slave. I know it's going to happen. And then a moment later, he turns and he prays to Zeus, please make it so that my son will be an even greater warrior and an even greater king than I am. And after that prayer, he says he knows the future is fated. So somehow we think we can know the future with divine help because it's fated. And we believe almost at the same time that prayers can make things change and come out differently. And Homer's characters put all these contradictory currents in our beliefs about knowledge of the future on display for us to just think about. And maybe the most interesting of these premonitions about the future is Achilles with his prophecies of his dual fate. Either he's going to die young but win great glory, or he's going to go home and live a long life of obscurity at home. Now that's the famous dual fate of Achilles, but the funny thing is it's not there from the beginning. In Book 1, Thetis tells him he's destined to live a short life. But then, as he's sitting out, not fighting, reconsidering the whole heroic life, the whole heroic ethos that he's been devoted to, deciding this doesn't make any sense at all, he announces a different revelation. Now it seems he has the double fate, and he can stay and fight and die young, or he can go home and live a long life. And then in Book 18, his fate changes again after Patroclus dies, and he's filled with rage and fury, and there's no way he's not going to avenge that death. Then it seems his fate closes back into this one fate. His mother tells him, your fate is to die soon after Hector. Now that's all set from the beginning of time, it seems. And he says, okay, then I'm going to die soon because I've got to kill Hector. So we experience our strong premonitions as revelations of what's fated to be. But is fate a force that governs our lives from outside, or something else? Is it what it has to be given our character? Is it even what is going to be given our character and our thoughts right now, and maybe then is open to change. The fourth level on which Homer's gods function is the hypothetical, the thought experiment. And mortality is a central theme of the poem, of course. Homer's favorite word for human beings is mortals. We are what we are because we have to die, I think is his very profound thought. And the gods are an alternative counter-reality. They're human in their desires for pleasure and company and love and adventure and power. They're much more lighthearted. They love to party and enjoy themselves. They enjoy sex as we do, but their sex is kind of weightless. There's nothing at stake. Think about the ridiculous goings-on between Zeus and Hera compared with the very moving scenes that we see between Hector and Andromache, for whom everything is at stake in their being there for each other. They have no strong friendships to compare with Achilles' friendship with Patroclus. Because they're invulnerable, they don't need each other in the same way. And of course, there are no citizens among the gods. There is a king, Zeus, but he doesn't seem to be needed by his people in the way that Hector is needed by his people, and so he has a lot of trouble ruling them, and there doesn't seem to be anything very impressive about his rule. The gods are concerned with honor as humans are, but less intensely. They don't need honor as a compensation for death. They don't need what Sarpedon says to Glaucus in Book 12. When he talks about how they need to fight because their people need them, and it's their duty, but then he says, man, supposing you and I escaping this battle would be able to live on forever, ageless, immortal, so neither would I myself go on fighting in the foremost, nor would I urge you to in the fighting where men win glory. But now, seeing that the spirits of death stand close about us in their thousands, no man can turn aside nor escape them. Let us go on and win glory for ourselves or yield it to others. The gods don't have any of that intense, weighty, difficult choice to make. The gods are interested in war as Homer presents them, and this is a difference with Hesiod, but any dangerous wars or revolutions that they might have faced are pushed very, very far back into the dim background of their consciousness. All the wars where everything is at stake occur among human beings. And maybe as a consequence of all these things, the gods in Homer seem to be less wise, at least about human things. 3 examples. Odysseus understands better than Athena what it's going to take to stop the troops when that rout happens in Book 2. He knows the need for force. He knows the need to speak in different ways to different human beings. Athena didn't seem to know that. Thetis doesn't understand Achilles' sorrow at the loss of Patroclus anywhere nearly as well as Antilochus does. And Hermes doesn't understand as well as Priam does what has to be done to persuade the hard-hearted Achilles to relent and give back Hector's body. The gods do have arts. Hephaestus makes beautiful things. They have music. Apollo plays the lyre, and the muses sing. But what they sing besides the exploits of men we don't hear. And in fact, the gift of poetry seems to be uniquely human. Some of the most beautiful lines of poetry in the book are those of Glaucus to Diomedes when he talks about mortality. And they're echoed by a god. So let me just show you the comparison. Then in turn, the shining heart of Hippolochus answered, high-hearted son of Tydeus, why ask of my generation? As is the generation of leaves, so is that of humanity. The wind scatters the leaves on the ground, but the live timber burgeons with leaves again in the season of spring returning. So one generation of men will grow while another dies. Yet if you wish to learn all this and be certain of my genealogy, there are plenty of men who know it. There is a city, Ephyre, in the corner of horse-pasturing Argos. There lived Sisyphus, that sharpest of all men. And he goes on to tell the story of his family. Having just seemed to face with complete clarity the fact that we all die and are forgotten, he tells the story that he hopes is not going to be forgotten, that will prevent him from being forgotten. And his hope comes burgeoning back, like those leaves or acorns fallen on the floor of the forest, which keep bursting forth again. So we have hope combined with memory in a very powerful way in human beings. And by contrast, Apollo says in Book 21, to Poseidon, shaker of the earth, you would have me be as one without prudence if I am to fight even you for the sake of insignificant mortals, who are as leaves are, and now flourish and grow warm with life and feed on what the ground gives, but then again fade away and are dead. Therefore, with all speed, let us give up this quarrel and let the mortals fight out their own battles. So all the depth and all the passion and all the poetry seems to be on the side of the mortals. And it's not. And human beings seem to become capable of the greatest nobility when they face their mortality and they reflect on it and when they let themselves grieve and they search for ways to redeem life in the face of its terrible limits, as many of the heroes do and as Achilles does above all, I think. One of the ways that Homer portrays the Greeks as superior to the Trojans is that they face death more squarely and they let themselves cry, and they know that they're strong enough to cry and still turn and be brave again. And it's not surprising, I think, that it's the Greeks that went on to develop tragedy. Then finally, we've got the ontological level. There are all kinds of hints and intriguing suggestions about whether the gods have the power and the immortality and even the existence that they're thought to have. Among the gods, Zeus's power seems to rest especially on everybody's belief that he's powerful. And one of the things that Homer seems to like to play with in this regard is the dual accounts. So consider the opening of the book, where the cause of the whole story seems to be both Achilles' anger and Zeus's will. In Book 5, Diomedes attacks two brothers, Phegeus and Idaeus. He kills Phegeus. And then at 5:20, Homer says, and Idaeus, leaping left the fair-wrought chariot, nor had he the courage to stand over his stricken brother. Even so, he could not have escaped the black death spirit, but Hephaestus caught him away and rescued him, shrouded in darkness, that the aged man, his father, might not be left altogether desolate. But the son of high-hearted Tydeus drove off the horses and gave them to his company to lead back to the hollow vessels. Now, as the high-hearted Trojans watched the two sons of Dares, one running away and one cut down by the side of his chariot, the anger in all of them was stirred. So what just happened? We got two accounts. In one account, it was Hephaestus who saved one of the brothers. In the other account, he simply ran away. These are two very insignificant people, but this dual account seems to raise the question, what is really going on in other cases of gods saving humans? Then there are the hints that the gods are not quite necessarily immortal. Thetis claims that she saved Zeus's life. Hephaestus tells a story that he was almost killed by Zeus and was made lame when he tried to help his mother Hera against Zeus. Ares, more than once, is almost killed. Sleep was almost killed. Poseidon complains that the Achaeans, by building a wall, have ensured that they're going to be always remembered as long as the dawnlight is scattered. And Zeus says to him, you'll always be remembered too. Is he not always going to be there? Then there are hints of the gods' limited power. For example, when Athena she heals Diomedes and makes him untremulous. But then it turns out that the effects don't last, and we see him trembling and shuddering later in the same book. And later, she wants to drive Ares out of the battle, but she can't do it herself without Diomedes' help. The gods, in fact, are always needing human agents to get things done. And then we've got all these questions about the gods' power vis-a-vis fate. So, for example, what can it mean that Ares might have perished if it hadn't been for Hermes, or his own swift feet, or the doctor who heals him because he was not made to be among the mortals. So on this, what I'm calling the ontological level, the whole premise that there really are immortal gods is being playfully, repeatedly called into question, even while on the literal level, grammatically, they're certainly there and supposed to be immortal. But then why all these alarms and fears and stories of things almost happening that were always fated never to have happened? I wonder if Homer isn't saying that Zeus's power among the gods rests on the fear that everybody has, that he might do what he in fact can't do, which is to kill them. Does his power among human beings also rest on a fear that he might do what he in fact can't do? And then, beyond making us wonder about the existence and the power of the gods, what is he doing with all these multiple shifting explanations for events that have divine action and fate and human action coming in and giving redundant explanations of the same thing? I think he's pointing us to this very philosophical question: what's the ultimate cause of things being the way they are? Is it natural necessities that govern the natural world and human beings? Is it some kind of foreordained ironclad fate that constrains even the gods? Is it the will of the gods? Is will at the bottom of things that could be otherwise, but simply isn't? Or is it human choice? And somehow, we seem at different times to believe in different ones of these, all of these by turn, and our beliefs need to be sorted out. And Homer is making it look like an intriguing project to sort them out. And in telling Hector's story, I think he gives us some clues. So Hector goes down beneath Achilles' spear because Athena helps Achilles. But she does this by taking Hector's wits away with a fit of irrational hope. Hector also falls because Zeus's scales reveal that it's his fated day to die. And he falls for the very human reason that he won't go back inside, which he could do and save his life, because he's afraid of the reproaches of Polydamas, that he shouldn't have been out there with the army risking the city, and he'd rather die than go back and be safe. He was a coward, and he's dying because he can't face the fact that he, in fact, was cowardly and was being courageous, being rash, out of a fear of having that be known. So all of this seems to add up to the thought, in the case of Hector, maybe the explanation of fate that's the deepest is your fate is what's deepest in your heart, your character, that drives you to choose what you do. So to conclude, I'd like to suggest that all these features of Homer's account of the gods contributed to his education of the Greeks as a people who became outstanding for their keen sense of beauty, their celebration of humanity in arts and in poetry, their invention of tragedy, their invention of republican self-government, and their discovery of philosophy. A bit more on each of these. The keen sense of the beautiful, I think, comes especially in giving the gods themselves beautiful human forms and having all aspects of human life touched by the divine. The celebration of humanity comes from the thought that men are almost like gods, that our struggles are of cosmic significance, our fates are of concern to what's highest in the universe. We're mortal, but not quite without hope. After all, there was Heracles who went to the Isles of the Blessed. Our worst errors are cases of gods like ruin or delusion taking us over, and not necessarily a sign of inner defectiveness. The sense of the tragic in human life is heightened by Homer's presentation of life as so brief and precious, and even more rich and precious to the extent that it's brief. And his presentation of the best men is willing to shed tears, and his presentation of the gods is touched by human concerns and human sorrows that they can't stop. And his presentation of human suffering is not mainly due to divine punishment, but to a fate that's hostile or indifferent, but not completely hostile and indifferent. And then I think the keen sense of honor and rivalry for excellence that we see in the poem contributed to having a people that was prepared to develop republican self-government with this pride in humanity, the pride in their courage, the belief that the gods especially loved people like Achilles, who stood up to the bully Agamemnon and wasn't willing to let his injustice go unchallenged. And finally, I think by encouraging human self-confidence and by filling his poems with so many rich puzzles about the ultimate causes of things, Homer helped to cultivate a people who would be intellectually courageous enough and curious enough to discover philosophy. So I think it's probably no accident that the civilization that did discover or invent philosophy, the only one that ever did it, the ancient Greeks, had this incredibly curious Homer as its greatest teacher. Now, all this, I think, was a calculated risk. So Homer, in contrast to the Bible, has made, I think, a decision to inculcate pride and work against the natural human tendency to feel unworthy and guilty, and to the tendency to fatalistic passivity, and the tendency to have an intense sense of dependence on the gods when things are going badly. So Homer seems to agree with Aristotle that most men are too humble rather than too proud. He also seemed to make an interesting, maybe calculated risk in encouraging us to doubt the gods' justice. And I wonder if he thought human beings are going to hope for divine justice given any encouragement at all. The greatest danger is that they'll cower in fear and guilt when it would be better for them to stand on their own feet and be tougher in the face of suffering or more daring. Then there's the question, in encouraging this human pride, is he encouraging too much complacency or too much arrogance? And I think what counteracts both of these tendencies is that for those that make the Iliad their Bible, there's such a keen sense of honor and high ideals that are depicted in an inspiring way, and the strong sense of life's brevity and preciousness, even for minor figures, with lesser joys and sorrows that Homer manages to weave into the story. And in terms of preventing arrogance and cruelty, Homer seems to think maybe that it's not by trying to inculcate humility or a sense of sinfulness that this is done best, but by cultivating grace and beauty and humanity and a sense of honor and a pride in freedom and courage, so that tyrants are going to meet with spirited opposition. It's an interesting calculated risk, and I'm glad that Homer took it. Thank you very much.